These two, they look familiar.
Really?
Yeah, so do you, John.
Yeah, I feel like we've met.
We feel a little bit different right now.
That's it.
I can scream really loud, you know.
That's them.
You are those guys?
Yeah, I think so.
These guys
Yeah, I think we were really loud people in the stadium.
are those guys. Without all that screaming,
Yeah, we are kind of quiet right now.
Oh yeah, that's all right.
I don't want to hurt your ears.
without all that makeup,
The Seahawk beak going
Seahawk
across.
beak going across.
but with a story to
I
tell,
was like shaking like this. I was so nervous.
like no other Seahawks fan.
We had 211 people on the middle of the football field.
That's Jeff and Dee Dee in the most important day of their lives.
The only wedding ever on the 50-yard line.
September 20th, 1998, Kingdom, before the game.
Redskins. And we won.
That's when everyone began calling them
Mr. and
Mr. and
Mrs.
Mrs.
Seahawk.
Seahawk.
this Seahawks obsession they share
She's louder than I am.
Yeah.
has transformed their lives
12th woman and 12th man.
and transformed their Auburn home. It's turned into a big blue and green shrine.
This is when we went to the Super Bowl the last time. And that's us cheering on the street. In the snow, of course, in Detroit. It was awesome. That was a great time.
And they've had a great time collecting
Everything.
We have a Seahawk beer chiller.
the bedroom, the bathroom.
Even the plates, dishes.
It's all Seahawks.
What I do during game day is hug them every time.
They have Seahawks stuff.
This plays music, Christmas one.
Here.
And there's a wagon up there that I had to have.
There.
That's True Blue fans, that's us.
Everywhere.
Marshawn Lynch right there with his Skittles, just staring right at you. Watch out.
And over
And
here,
this is our dead Christmas tree.
the tree the couple refuses to take down until after the Super
So,
Bowl.
look at this. Dear Santa, all I want is for the Seahawks to win the Super Bowl. Thank you.
Everywhere you turn. Inside their home.
Got the Seahawk carpet.
And now let's go outside for a sec. Look at this. The pride, the love, and that pile of concrete. It's Kingdom concrete. No question, this obsession has cemented
No better bond.
their relationship.
You have your ups, you have your downs, but man, when the ups are up, it is great.
I wonder, is he talking about the marriage or the Seahawks?
Both.
Well, good morning. Welcome to Northridge Church. My name's Aaron. I'm our youth pastor, and no matter where you're joining us from, we are glad that you're here this morning. Those people are crazy, right? I mean, that's weird. She hugs the poster of Russell Wilson every week before the game. That's strange. Okay, am I alone in this? Like, why do they have everything in their house is Seahawks? They got married on the field? I feel like I'm equal parts fascinated and terrified by these people's obsession with the Seahawks. It's insane to me. They got concrete, all of their decorations. When people come over, like, what else do you talk about? Well, there's some more Seahawks stuff. It's totally weird to me. I mean, they never miss a home game. She hugs a poster and all of their decorations, their dishes. That's very strange. That's very strange. But the thing is, people get obsessed about a lot of stuff. Like, they get obsessed about the Seahawks. Okay, great. But people get, they're into whatever it is that they're into. Like, a year and a half ago, if you would have asked any middle school girl who the greatest band of all time was, they would have said One Direction. And they loved One Direction. Now, they're on a hiatus right now, which is still a sensitive subject. Don't bring it up. But they loved One Direction. In fact, you could see them, at concerts or whatever. They listen to their music and they run to the front row and they're yelling and screaming and reaching and crying and snot bubbles and these are some ugly criers. They are obsessed with One Direction. They loved it. The greatest band of all time. They could not get over how amazing One Direction is. And people get passionate about tons of stuff, whether it's, the Seahawks, sports teams, or celebrities, or bands, or TV shows. Gilmore Girls just dropped another season. People get really into Gilmore Girls. If you don't know what that is, you're probably fine. But yeah, so whatever it is they're into, the people start talking about it, and they're like, wow, you are obsessed with that. For me, it's this app called Evernote, which is just a cloud-based data storage app, and it is awesome. It's really cool. I use it a lot. And when I start talking about it, people do exactly what you're doing right now, which is go, is he for real? And my wife goes, yeah, he's for real. Because I have posters of it and stuff. I'm just kidding. I don't. You got nervous. You're like, why do we pay this guy? But anyway, people get obsessed with whatever it is that they're into. They love it. And they start talking about it, and people say, like, wow, you might have a problem. But I've come to a couple conclusions about people like me. Whenever it comes to Evernote or people with One Direction or the Seahawks, it's definitely Mr. and Mrs. Seahawk. First of all, I think the first thing I notice is they look kind of ridiculous, right? I mean, these are grown adults who have their faces painted every single Sunday to go to a game. That's kind of crazy. But then, second of all, I've come to the conclusion, these people, they seem like they're worshiping, don't they? I mean, like, more than what happens on Sunday mornings in churches across America and around the world. Like, these people are full on worshiping, and they're obsessed with it. Why? I mean, we're talking about a group of grown men who can bring a ball down a predetermined length of grass into a rectangle that's painted differently at the end. Right? Like, why are we obsessed with this? Or like, they're a band, or like, you can remember lots of things with this app. Like, it's not that cool. Why do we have physical bodily responses to things that we get so obsessed with? I mean, we're seriously worshiping. Why do we do that? Well, I think they can't help it. We can't help it. None of us can. We are born to worship something. We're born to worship something. And that's what we're going to spend this morning talking about, the idea of worship. And I'm hoping to convince you that we are all born to worship something, and we're all worshiping. And you might be thinking, if you grew up in church, you're like, okay, well, worship is when you're singing songs to Jesus, on Sunday mornings or wherever. And okay, so I guess I see what you mean. But if you didn't grow up in church, or you're not sure about God or following Jesus, you're kind of like, okay, I feel pretty confident that I don't worship. That's not a thing that I do. I don't even know what that word means, and I don't like the music that you play here, so I feel pretty confident that I don't worship. And that might be fair, but I'm hoping that this morning, as we walk through what worship is and how you can know that you're doing it, that you will realize that you, as well as everyone, we are all worshipers. And so we're going to spend some time looking at what the Bible has to say about worship. And then after a while, we're going to land in Romans chapter 1, which will be on page 911 if you're using one of our Bibles in Romans 1. But normally what we do on Sunday mornings is we just take a passage and we'll explain it and then just kind of say what it means for our everyday life. But instead, this week, I want to spend some time kind of building a framework before we get to Romans chapter 1. I think that passage, which will be our main passage, will make a lot more sense, I hope, if we spend some time kind of building up the ideas, what it means and what it means for our life before we actually even get to that passage. So if you'll allow me to do that, I hope that Romans 1 will make a little bit more sense. But we are talking about worship, and I believe we're born to worship something. And in the Bible, when you hear the word worship, there are usually two words that are predominantly used to describe it. The Bible was written mostly in Hebrew and Greek, and there's a Hebrew word and a Greek word that are most commonly used, and they both just mean to bow down. Worship just really means, those words mean to bow down, because in most of the cultures that the Bible was to which the Bible was written, that was an act of worship. I mean, you bowed down to a god or to a deity. And so it means to bow down. But you might want to jot on the side, this won't be on the screen, but just another idea. There's another important word that's used in the Bible for worship, and it just means basically to serve. To serve. It's used in a lot of the same contexts. They're used together. I'll show you a passage where they're used together. And it's just a generic word for any kind of work, really, but it's used in conjunction with worship, meaning to serve. So worship just means, in terms of the meaning of the word, to bow down or to serve. And some examples of where it shows up are in Genesis chapter 22, verse 5. This is a guy named Abraham, and it says, he said to his servants, stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship and then come back to you. That's that idea of bowing down. We're going to bow down and then come back to you. 2 Samuel 12, it says, then David got up from the ground after he had washed, put on lotions, and changed his clothes. He went into the house of the Lord and worshiped. That's that idea of bowing down. Or in Joshua 24, it says, now fear the Lord and serve him. That's that idea, that different word always frequently used in conjunction with worship. Fear the Lord and serve him with all faithfulness. Throw away the gods your ancestors worshipped or bowed down to beyond the Euphrates River and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. Those are those words used in conjunction with each other. Bowing down, serving. Or then in the New Testament, in Matthew 14, this is the passage we were in last week, it says, then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, truly you are the Son of God. That idea of bowing down. So worship just means simply to bow down or to serve. And if you're thinking now, like, okay, if that's exclusively what worship means, then I feel pretty confident that I don't ever worship. Because I don't bow down to like anything. I don't bow down to God. I don't bow down to Buddha. I don't do a lot of bowing. Like, that's not something I do regularly. And I understand that, but I think that there's a broader definition maybe that we could explain from God's word that'll help us understand more of what worship truly is, and to help us see that we actually engage in this all the time. I think the Bible would support this definition, and I'll explain how in just a minute. And it's going to seem a little convoluted, but I hope by the end of today this is going to make a little bit more sense. I would say it this way, though, that you are worshiping when you are acting in a way that is consistent with what matters most to you. You are worshiping when you are acting in a way that's consistent with what matters most to you. And so I do want to take a moment and just pause for all of you grammar nerds out there. Worshiping can be spelled with either one or two P's. I checked. So relax, take a deep breath. You were like, it's two P's. I could feel it already up here. One or two. You're welcome. Okay. You know you're worshiping when you're acting in a way that's consistent with what matters most to you. So let's use the bowing down example, okay? People were worshiping when they bowed down to an idol. In other words, they viewed the idol, that God, as the most important thing in their life, and so they acted in a way that was consistent with that. Well, if an idol is the most important thing in your life, you bow down to it, or you offer sacrifices to it, or you don't eat certain foods, or you don't kill certain animals, or you wear certain colors, or you don't wear certain colors, but you bow down to it because that idol, that image, is the most important thing in your life. That person was worshiping when they bowed down, demonstrating this thing is of infinite worth to me. I value this thing above all else, so I will bow down to it. That was worship. It means bowing down. So think about that then, out of the context of bowing down, into the context of that One Direction fanatic, okay? Think about worship in that sense. We're worshiping, we're acting in a way that's consistent with what matters most to us. So this fan is going to spend way too much money on tickets. They're going to go and they're going to wait in line for hours. They're going to listen to the music of One Direction before they get to the concert, where One Direction will play the exact same songs that they just were listening to in the car. And then when they get close to the stage, they're going to be reaching out and screaming and crying and the snot bubbles and all that stuff from before. And they're doing that because this is the thing that matters most to them in the world. And so they're doing something that's consistent with that. And doesn't that make sense? I mean, think about it. If the most important thing in the world to you were within arm's reach, and you couldn't quite reach it, but you were right there, wouldn't it make sense that you would have an emotional response, that you'd be crying and screaming and reaching and the bubbles and all that? Doesn't that make sense? Because they're acting in a way that's consistent with what matters most to them. And then they're going to buy a whole bunch of overpriced merchandise afterwards. Because they're acting in a way that's consistent with what matters most to them. So the reality is, for us, anytime in our everyday life that we're acting in a way that's consistent with what matters most to us, we are worshiping. And God fully understands this dynamic. I mean, He made us with this tendency, and He knows that we will inevitably worship something. And whatever we worship, our actions are going to be consistent with that object of our worship. And so then it's no coincidence that when God gave the 10 Commandments, his laws for the people of Israel, the very first command that He gave them was this. In Exodus 20, verse 3, it says, "You shall have no other gods before me." Because basically, God knew if they had followed that one rule, if they had understood that, if they had worshiped God alone, if nothing else was before God in their life, if He was the only thing in the universe that mattered most to them, well, then their actions would have followed. The rest of the commandments would have just been like, sprinkles on top, because they would have acted in a way that was consistent with Him being most important. That's why He started there, because they would then choose actions that would reflect His importance in their life. Because we are born to worship something, and whatever we are worshiping will dictate how we act. So, here are just a few more principles. If this isn't clear to you yet, we are worshiping when we're acting in a way that's consistent with what matters most to us. And to take it a step further, I just want to give you two principles that will maybe guide us a little bit. And the first one is this: you can worship anything. You can. Literally anything in the world. We're going to see in our main passage here in just a minute that humanity chooses as a group collectively to worship like reptiles. Why? It doesn't make a lot of sense, but it's possible. You can. It's doable. Because all it takes for something to be an object of worship is for someone to act as if that is the most important thing in their life, and then act consistently. If they're doing that, then they're worshiping. So anything can be worship. A tree, a person, pride, acceptance, sex, an idea, the prom, Ohio State beating Michigan, whatever. No matter how stupid or small or foolish or shallow, anything can be worshiped. You can worship anything. But then second of all, you are always worshiping something. You're always worshiping something. There's never a moment when your thoughts or your actions are not motivated by something. We are at every moment, at every juncture, worshiping something. And so I want to illustrate this a little bit with an illustration we're going to stick with that I hope you can follow with me. And that's the idea. I want us to picture that every single human heart, the heart is the place where we decide who we're going to be, where our emotions are, where we make our decisions, what we want to do or be. I want you to imagine that every single human heart contains a White House. Every human heart contains a White House, like 1600 Pennsylvania Ave, where the President of the United States lives, all right? Imagine that every human heart has a White House, and that White House is where every single decision and every direction of your life, that's where it's governed, is from that White House, from the Oval Office of your life. And I want to submit that there is always, always, always something in the Oval Office, inside of the White House, that's inside of every human heart. There's always something in the Oval Office. And we as humans are acting in a way that is consistent with whatever is the sitting president inside of the Oval Office in our hearts. Every action we ever take is consistent with that person, and that is worship when we act in a way that's consistent. So you're always worshiping. And you know this well, we know this well as a country right now. Whenever there's a new person elected president, whenever that happens, lots of things change, right? I mean, we're watching this unfold right now. Hundreds of people immediately lose their jobs, and hundreds of new people have jobs, or they get appointed to jobs. The entire cabinet changes. The president is able to appoint a lot of people, obviously. A lot of things change. But interestingly, you might not know this part of it, the White House itself actually undergoes a lot of transformation as well. The White House itself physically changes from this is crazy to me, literally from one president to the next. In January, when they make that full transfer, there is a 5-hour window, where one family is moved out of the White House and a new family is moved into the White House. Everything is moved in and out. You should watch the Discovery Channel special on it. It's amazing. I definitely did. But I mean, they change the carpet in some cases. They change the furniture and the decorations. They put the clothes in the drawer. They put the toothpaste and the toothbrush into the master bathroom. They do a full transformation. The whole thing is done by 96 White House staffers. Because they're not just going to call some random moving company hey, you want to carry the president's stuff? That's not how they're going to do it. So they get the White House staffers to do it. So the main White House chef is carrying couches in during this 5-hour window. It's during the period during the inaugural address, and they're down at the Capitol building, and then he has that parade where they walk, down the mall, and he's smiling and waving and kissing babies, and that whole parade. They're still carrying his stuff into the White House during that. Okay, that's a grand slow down technique. That's all they're trying to do is give us a couple more minutes. They're trying to get his couches into the White House. All right? It's crazy. That happens with every single new president. There was 2 minutes to spare. Got to watch the Discovery Channel. Find it. It's got to be on Netflix or something. That's for every single new president. Every single time a new person steps into power, the landscape of the White House and the jobs attached to it completely change. And from then on out, the administration is expected to act in a way that's consistent with their new leader. And I believe that is exactly what happens in our hearts. There's always someone or something in the Oval Office in the White House of our hearts, and our actions, our thoughts rapidly come into alignment with whatever it is that we've placed in power in our lives. And the moment we do that, we begin to worship that object, and there's always someone or something there. Every action we ever take is a reflection of what it is that we have placed in control of our lives. And the crazy thing is, I don't believe that Oval Office can ever be vacant, even for a second. It can never be empty because we are born worshiping and we are perpetually worshiping something. And in any given moment, we as humans, we're notorious for just trading and swapping and exchanging and switching what we're worshiping in any given moment. We end up electing a new president not every 4 years, every couple of minutes. We put a new person in charge. From one regime to the next, to the next, to the next. And transfers of power are actually, they're interesting things. Because peaceful transfers of power by election are something that we kind of take for granted in our country. Now, I recognize right now there's a lot of upheaval, a lot of turmoil related to this recent election, and so it doesn't feel like a peaceful transfer of power necessarily, but in any grand scale, we are still experiencing absolutely a peaceful transfer of power. A non-peaceful transfer of power is like a massive civil war, like a bloodbath between families who are warring for control over the government, all right? We experience peaceful transfers of power based on election, and those are a new phenomenon in our world. They're not an old thing. They're relatively new. In fact, here's some fun facts. The cotton gin, the lightning rod, bifocals, and hot air balloons are all older than peaceful transfers of power from one political party to the next by election. That's kind of cool. I like those kind of facts. The Mirror liked those facts better when I was practicing. Anyway, 1801 is the first year cited in human history. America is given credit for the first peaceful transfer of power by election. Thomas Jefferson was elected president over then President John Adams, who he had served as vice president for, and the Republicans got power from the Federalists, different Republican Party, but he received power. That peaceful transfer of power was the first time in human history recorded that there was a peaceful transfer of power from one regime to the next by election. That's new. 1801, that was very recent, and that's very fun for the two of you that like American history. But for our application, for what we're talking about, I believe we have peaceful transfers of power in our hearts all the time. I think we have peaceful transfers of power in our hearts all the time. And we allow different people, priorities, and feelings to sit in the Oval Office, and we worship them by conforming our actions to whatever it is that they desire. We just swap out the administration from one to the next. Power is transferred, and there's someone new in the Oval Office, and it doesn't take years of campaigning and debates and elections and the Electoral College. We just let it happen. We just transfer power from one moment to the next. The carpet changes, new chef, new furniture, new clothes, new toothbrush, new president. So one moment it's God, and then it's sex, and then it's acceptance, and then sleep, and then your kids, and then laziness and sex and anger and God, and he stays there for a while, and then it's your boyfriend, and then it's getting into a good college, and then it's your comfort, and then it's your kids, and it's this never-ending cycle of just transferring power from one regime to the next, one administration to the next, and then acting in a way that's consistent with that thing being the most important thing in our life, worshiping it. So you can transfer power between various things, but it can never be absent. We're always worshiping something. We are willing worshipers of whatever is in the Oval Office of our hearts, and there are no checks and balances. There are no term limits. And that is the framework that I think that we need to understand as we go into Romans 1 right now. Romans 1 on page 911. I think we need to understand that dynamic, that we are willing worshipers of whatever's in the White House of our heart, and we will act in a way that's consistent with that administration. I think we have to understand that as we read Romans chapter 1, verse 21. This is a letter written by a guy named Paul to the church and the Christians in the city of Rome. And here's what he says, starting in verse 21. We'll read 21 and 22. Romans 1:21. It says, "For although they knew God," this is humanity, by the way. This is a description of humanity, spiraling ever out of control, further away from God, choosing to worship things other than Him. It says, "For although they, humanity, knew God, they neither glorified Him as God nor gave thanks to Him. But their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools." So here's humanity. They're spiraling out of control, worse and worse and worse. They knew God, but they didn't glorify Him as God. They thought they were wise, and they became foolish. Their hearts are darkened, and that's the situation that humanity's in. And it continues in Romans 1:23. What happens next is they exchanged the glory of immortal God for images. Images made to look like mortal human beings and birds and animals and reptiles. So here's humanity. They've exchanged God's glory, the glory of the God who never dies, who's forever praised. They traded that. They transferred power from God to an image made to look like humans and birds and reptiles. Like, what are we doing? Why are we doing this right now? And that might sound totally crazy. Like, why would they transfer power from God to that? But here's what happens next. Romans 1:24. It says, "Therefore God gave them over to the sinful desires of their hearts, to sexual impurity, for the degrading of their bodies with one another." So in other words, they made this foolish decision to transfer power from one thing to the next, and then now images of man and birds and reptiles are sitting on the throne of their heart in the White House and the Oval Office, and now they are doing things consistent with those things being in control. They're degrading their bodies with sexual immorality. They're worshiping something other than God. And they began to make decisions further and further from honoring God because of what they chose to worship. And it just keeps going. In verse 25, it says, "Not only this, they exchanged the truth about God for a lie. And they worship and served created things rather than the Creator who's forever praised." Amen. And there it is. It's the trading of the truth for a lie, transferring the reins of power from the truth to a lie. And what happens is they become willful worshipers of that lie, and they act in a way that's consistent. They allow that lie to live in the White House, and they serve the created things rather than the Creator, because that's how this process works. We transfer power between the various things that war for control of the White House, and when we do that, when we act in a way that's consistent, and we worship. And I don't know if you caught all that exchange language through this passage. It says they exchanged the glory of immortal God for images. They gave them over, and they exchanged the truth about God for a lie. It's all this trading and swapping that's going on in our hearts. And so they traded the truth of God for a lie, and then they worship the created things rather than the Creator. And when you put it that way, doesn't it sound pretty stupid? Why would you worship created things instead of the one who made it? It's like looking at like a really great piece of art or like a really great photograph, and you're looking at it and you're admiring it in an art gallery, and it's like, wow, that's so wonderful. Look at all the colors and the tone and the texture, and wow, this is a great work of art. That work of art deserves to be praised because that work of art is awesome in and of itself. Well, we might say that, but that's not what we would mean. We would mean like the artist. That painting is only as brilliant as the brilliance of the painter. Or that photograph is only as awesome as the brilliance of the photographer. Because we understand that painting didn't just get there on its own. There's someone behind it that's worthy of praise, not the work itself. And so it doesn't make any sense. Why would humanity choose to worship the created things rather than the Creator? I mean, sunsets are cool and the animal kingdom's amazing, and don't get me wrong about the fact that creation is awesome, but why would we give credit to the creation rather than the one who made it? When we make this transfer, when we allow a lie to sit in the Oval Office instead of the truth, we sometimes make very foolish decisions about what gets our worship. Very foolish decisions. And it just illustrates this point that I want us to remember, that everyone worships something, but not every something is worth worshiping. Everyone worships something, but not every something is worth worshiping. And sometimes what we choose to worship, or what we choose to place in the White House of our hearts, it's just dumb. It's just not a good decision. And it's kind of scary too. Because when you think about it, when you're worshiping, you're acting in a way that's consistent with what matters most to you. So depending on what you allow yourself to worship, you could end up doing some really crazy, some really stupid things with terrible results. If you worship comfort and ease, you're not going to retire early. You're not going to get good grades. That room in your house is never going to get cleaned up. If you worship pleasure, you could wind up addicted to a substance or to a website that ruins your life. If you worship acceptance from your boss, you could wind up with a destroyed relationship at home or willingness to cut corners so that you look good. If you worship significance from your significant other, you could wind up with a photo that you hoped would stay private floating around on the internet. If you worship control, you could end up micromanaging the life of everyone around you to the point that you destroy those relationships. Because everyone worships something, but not every something that we could worship is worth worshiping. And when we trade the truth of God for a lie, the Bible says that God turns us over to the consequences of those sin choices. It says God let them go. It says He gave them over. It says that in verse 24, but then it also says it again in verse 26. It says, because of this, God gave them over. And then it proceeds to describe a whole bunch of things that humanity ends up doing with terrible consequences, because God allows us the consequences of the things we choose to worship. That's not where we want to be. We do not want to be in a situation where we've allowed something other than God to sit in the Oval Office. So how do we decide what we're worshiping? Hopefully I've convinced you that you do worship and that you want to carefully choose what it is that you worship. But how do you evaluate it? How do you figure out what it is that's going on in there already? And this is where it gets tough, I'll admit, because sometimes you can't necessarily judge by your own external actions. It can be hard to see, but it's especially tricky in other people. We can't just assume that we know what's going on in their hearts based on what they're doing externally. Like, for instance, worship itself, like singing, what we typically think of as worship. You could have two people at any of our campuses. We've got these awesome live bands, and somebody could be on the front row, two people worshiping. Both of them have their hands in the air, their eyes are closed, and they're both just singing it out. And you could, you look at those people, and one of them could be truly worshiping God, thankful for what God has done through the gospel, through Jesus Christ, and just expressing a heart of praise. And the person next to them could be worshiping themselves because of how good they sound or because of how cool they look. You know what I mean? That's never going to be something I struggle with, but it could happen to someone. But you can't always tell. I would encourage you to be very cautious about how you evaluate other people's hearts. And it can be hard to know what's even going on in our own hearts. But I will tell you, I don't have a foolproof means of identifying what specifically you're worshiping, but I do believe I have a foolproof means of identifying whether or not what you're worshiping is God. I think that we can know for sure, based on a couple of factors, whether or not what we're worshiping is God. And the first one is if you're willing to sin to get it. If you're willing to sin to get it, or if you sin when you don't get it. Those are two foolproof means of identifying that what you are worshiping is not God. If those conditions are true, you know for sure you have traded the glory of the immortal God for a lie, and you've crafted an idol, an image in your heart around the shape of whatever it is that you've decided to pursue, and that is in the Oval Office. And every sin we ever commit can be traced back to one of those factors. If you choose pornography, you've officially chosen to worship pleasure over God. If you choose to manipulate others through your sex appeal, you've traded God for pride or for pleasure or for image. If you choose laziness over doing what you know is right, you've traded God for comfort. If you disobey your parents, you've chosen rebellion and pride over God. If you choose gossip rather than kindness, you've traded God for a desire to hurt others. If you respond in anger with your spouse, you've traded God for the feeling of being right. If you respond in bitterness when your boss doesn't give you the promotion, you've traded God for success. If you respond in impatience with your kids, you've traded God for convenience. And every single sin you or I have ever committed can be traced back to something in that Oval Office that was not God. And if we're willing to sin to get what we want, or we sin when we don't get it, we're in a bad place. And don't think you're off the hook if sometimes your sin patterns don't demand obvious sin from you. If something that you worship that isn't God doesn't demand obvious sin from you, think about it this way, your love of fantasy football might not be wrong, but the fact that it leads you to watch every second of every football game on Sunday to see how your players are doing on the one day a week that you have to be with your family, you might be worshiping it. And I'm not saying that you can't watch football. I just mean that we all have hard questions that we need to ask about what is it that is in the Oval Office of our heart. So here's a good exercise for us all this week. I want us to answer the question, what do I tend to worship? What do I tend to worship? And everyone has something. I mean, you might have 4 or 5 or 10 things, that are your go-to idols, and we've all got them. And I'd encourage you to look beyond the surface, because it can be easy to assume, okay, I get angry, that means I have the idol of anger. But ask harder, deeper questions. Things like, when I was angry, what did I truly want? What was I hoping to accomplish in that moment? Because the chances are the emotion that you experience or the actions that you take, they might not have a clear answer in your heart about what it is that you're worshiping. There might be something more powerful, more potent, more sneaky going on in your hearts. I know for me, I have 2 major idols. They are pleasure and acceptance. And in my heart, you can bank on it. Any of the sins that I struggle with, they probably are going to come back to one of those 2 things. So I'm constantly swapping God, acceptance, pleasure, and acceptance, and God. And that's just what's going on in the White House of my heart. I cycle through it. That's the game I play. So what about you? What are you willing to sin to get? What's that thing that you will sin if you don't get it? Evaluate that this week. I know many of you are on a community group break. Maybe you just start a group text with the guys in your group, or with the girls in your group, and you just say, hey, look, here's what I'm thinking. Here's what I'm unearthing from my heart about what I believe I tend to worship. And just remember, when we exchange the truth of God for a lie, God gives us over to our idol and its consequences, and you don't want that. But that same principle is amazingly true on the positive side. When we establish the habit of leaving God in the White House of our hearts and worshiping Him with our everyday lives, we get to see the results of a presidency that could truly change everything. We get to act in ways that confuse our neighbors because we're so infused with both truth and grace. We get to raise families that are committed to God for generations because of how we modeled faith in our homes. We end up loving people so sacrificially that they can't understand what motivates us. That's the kind of results of leaving Jesus in the White House of our hearts can have. So what will I tend to worship? And who will I be 20 years from now if I continue to worship that person or that thing? That's a good question. See where it takes you. Because I think as a church, especially in America right now, we have gotten really good at asking that question about the American presidency and being really good analyzers of the question, do you realize what America could be like if she had been elected? Or do you realize what our world's going to be like with him in charge, with all of Congress on his side. Do you realize what our world's going to be like? Can you imagine 4 more years, 8 more years of her or him? Man, how many times did we play out that scenario? We became amazing at political analysis. We knew for sure what the future looked like if the candidate we didn't like got in charge. But have we thought about what 4 more years of acceptance in the Oval Office of our hearts could do to our lives? Have you thought about what 2 more terms of laziness in your presidency could do to your life? Have we analyzed that question? Have we posted on Facebook about that question? Because that's a question that could change our city. That could change your home. That could change our neighborhoods. That could change your family. If we were willing to say, I refuse to have another presidency of acceptance in my life. I refuse to give up power, transfer power peacefully to pleasure in my life. I refuse. What could our world look like? What could your family look like? What could our city look like if we were people who for the next 4 years consistently chose to place Jesus Christ in his rightful place in the Oval Office in the White House of our hearts and made every decision consistent with his administration? What kind of a world could we live in? What kind of a place could Rochester be? Maybe you're here today and none of this necessarily makes sense because you're like, I don't even know about God, or I don't know where I fit into this picture. I've never really worshiped before. I don't know how that works. Well, I want you to know beyond a shadow of a doubt that we are not about just changing people's behavior here at Northridge. We're not about just trying to make you a better person or, outweigh your good from your bad. Because I'm convinced that people who do the right things, who aren't followers of Jesus, actually can't worship God no matter what they do. They could do all of the right things, and none of them matter if it's not done from a place where Jesus Christ is in the Oval Office. If we're not doing it as an act of worship to God, it's of no value. So we want you today to know we're not asking you to just be a nice, good American citizen. Pay your taxes and go to work on time. We're asking all of us to be the kind of consistent Christ followers who place their faith in Jesus and understand that their sacrifice was paid by Jesus. He stood in their place, took all of the punishment for their sins, and as a result of that grace that was shown, they're able to live a life that pleases God by placing Jesus in his rightful place in the Oval Office and then choosing decisions every day and all day that give him all of the power so that our decisions are consistent with his leadership. That's what we want for you, not simple moralism and do better. And we pray that as a church this week, that together we could choose to worship the only person worthy of our worship, and that's Jesus alone. Let me pray. God, I ask that that would be true of us. What a world we could live in if for the next 4 years, the next administration, we chose to focus on being people who worshiped you and you only in our everyday lives. I ask that that would be true. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.